Well, I heard a story this week about Mozart, the great composer. Mozart, apparently the Vatican had this musical piece that it was based on Psalm 51, and they had kept it a secret. Not a secret like that nobody could hear it, but they wouldn't let anyone have the sheet music for it. So no one else could play it or reproduce it or whatever. In order to hear it, you had to go to the Vatican. And they only played it at certain times of the year, certain celebration or certain things. And so no one had this music except for them. And they guarded it well. For over 200 years, they had this piece of music, and nobody knew how to play it. Except for those who were privileged to know it. But it was a beautiful piece of music, and it was about 12 minutes long. People would travel from all over to come to the Sistine Chapel to listen to this piece. Well, when Mozart was 14 years old, he went with his dad. And he went and he listened to this music one time and went home that night and transposed it. In other words, he wrote it out, note for note, all the different parts, the instruments, there were vocals, he wrote it all out. He went back the next day and heard it one more time and made just a few corrections. It was no longer a secret because now Mozart knew how to play it. And it got out there. Now, Mozart was a musical genius. And he was able to do this because he was a genius. But many musicians are able to do something on a lesser scale, but very similar, where you hear music and then they can say, okay, I know those notes, and write it out. Or you hear music and then you can play it. Like I hear someone play guitar, pick it up and listen to it and figure it out. Many musicians can do that. But how? How are they able to do that? Well, it's quite simple. They have trained their ears. They have learned to hear the song and hear the music and what's being played. And then they are able to play it. So their ear is trained to hear those notes, and they understand how music works. And so they're able to apply that training and that understanding to reproduce the music. Now, similarly, how does a person of faith live by faith and please God? Well, their eyes, spiritually speaking, but their eyes are trained to see more than what's just right in front of them. To see more than just the physical, what's happening and what's there on the surface. You see, they know God. And they understand how He works. And then they take that understanding of God and apply it to what they see. Now we're going to see an example of this today in David. He has a great God, and he knows it. And David will act in faith and succeed because of it. We have a great God who has done and will do great things. And if you are a person of faith, you might get to be a part of those great things that God is doing. And so as we begin here in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, as it begins, we see that God works in the background to set the stage. Look at verse 1 through 7. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in lines of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spearhead weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. And so the Philistines, they came over to fight against Israel. And the armies of the Philistine and Israel, they stationed themselves on opposite sides of the valley. And we're told about them, how they're set up there, and then we meet a guy named Goliath. And we're given this description of Goliath. He is the Philistines' champion. In other words, he is a great, mighty warrior. And we're told that he's about 9 feet or so tall. We're told that he has a bronze helmet. I don't know if you've ever worn even a batting helmet for baseball. It's kind of awkward. I can't imagine wearing a bronze helmet on my head. That would be heavy. But anyways, he wears this bronze helmet. He has bronze shin guards, and he's wearing this body armor that weighs about 126 pounds. Now, some of us wouldn't want to even lift to 126 pounds. He is wearing it and moving around with it. So 126 pounds. He has a javelin slung between his shoulders, and he has a large spear that has a 15-pound iron head on it. Now, what's the point of all of this description that we're given? It's quite simple. He's big and he's strong. He is someone that you don't want to mess with. All right? Just the sight of him would inspire fear. You don't want to mess with him. Then on top of all that, we're told that he had a shield and a shield bearer. So someone who went in front of him with a shield. What that means is that this guy carried a shield that was a full body shield. It was big. And so he could hide behind that as he was battling. And so someone else there to carry the shield for him as he was fighting. Which kind of gives you this picture that he's kind of has this impenetrable protection. And as you saw him come out, you might wonder if he was invincible. His appearance would definitely inspire fear. At the same time, as we are reading this, those of us who have read the previous chapter should probably think back to a statement that was made in the previous chapter. When Samuel was looking at the sons of Jesse, and God said, "Don't be so impressed with outward appearances." And so we might think back to that. But what we see here is that Saul and all the Israelite soldiers, those outward appearances is pretty much all they can see. That's all that they are noticing. That's all that they're thinking about. They'll see Goliath and they fear him. Look at verse 8. He stood and shouted at the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And so Goliath comes out and he proposes a simpler way to solve their conflict. He says, rather than all of the armies fighting, because that's messy and there's a lot of lives that would be lost, why don't we just take care of this with just 2 people? Me and whoever you got. Send someone out to fight me, and the 2 of us will fight, and whoever wins, we'll declare that side the winner. Now, This was not something that was totally uncommon. It happened. But I don't know how well it was followed, because usually when one guy lost, the army took off running and the one army would chase. They would still fight in the end anyway. But this is the proposition he makes. Let's just do this. 2 of us fight instead of everyone. Sounds good on one level, except for everyone looks at Goliath and says, I don't want to fight him. And so he comes out and he makes this challenge. He challenges Israel to send their best man to come fight against him. But when he makes this challenge, he's also very condescending towards them. He's arrogant and kind of brash. To begin with, he says, am I not, well, my version says a Philistine. Some versions say a, and some say the Philistine. Now, the Hebrew actually has the word the in it. So am I not the Philistine? And I think that's on purpose. I think he's making the point. I am the Philistine. So he's not just saying I represent the Philistines, but he's saying I am the ultimate Philistine. Who wants to fight me? And so he's bragging here. Am I not the Philistine? But at the same time, he says to them, I'm the ultimate Philistine. Aren't you the servants of Saul? You know, meager servants. Come fight me. So he's kind of putting them down as he saying this. He's insulting them as he challenges. But then he comes across and he's very direct. And he says, I defy you. He's taunting them here. He's like, you have no one who can stand up against me. I dare you to try and send someone. Where is he? No one's going to make it. No one can beat me. And how does Israel respond? Well, we're specifically told both Saul and Israel, so Saul and the army, are discouraged and really scared. And I think we're specifically told here Saul, because it's pointing out his lack of leadership. Do you remember why was Saul anointed king in the first place? To deliver Israel from the Philistines. And now he's being challenged by a Philistine, and Saul is shaking in his boots. He's scared just like everyone else. So Saul and the army are discouraged. They're really scared. It's because they look at what's in front of them and they agree, we have no chance. Let's keep reading verse 12. It says, now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, the next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his sheep at Bethlehem. Went back and forth from Saul, to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. And Jesse said to his son, take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also, take these 10 cheeses to the commander of the thousands. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them. And so we leave the scene of the battle here for a second in order to be told about David. We're introduced to David. He's the youngest of the sons of Jesse. His 3 oldest brothers have gone out to the battle. And we're told that David is going back and forth between Saul and his father's sheep. So David is serving Saul, and then going home and taking care of the sheep, and then going back to Saul when he needs him, and then taking care of the sheep. So he's going back and forth. Well, in the middle of this talk, we're also reminded about the situation in the valley. And we get a little extra information here. So this has been happening now. Goliath coming out and challenging Israel for 40 days. And not only that, but twice a day he's coming out and taunting the Israelites. Come on, let's fight. And so it's been a while here that Jesse's boys have been gone for the battle. So he sends David with some food and and to check on his brother's well-being. So Jesse is getting concerned. It's been a while, haven't heard anything. How are my sons doing? So he sends David out there to find them. Now, on the surface, what we see here is the reason for David going is just simply because Jesse is concerned for his sons. He says, check on their well-being and bring back some token. In other words, bring back some evidence that they're doing okay. So on the surface, that's all we see is Jesse is concerned for his sons. But there's another reason why David is going out there. God is getting David to the battlefield so he can be there at the right place at the right time, and David can do what God has called him to do. So God is getting David there to the battlefield so he can take the next step in becoming the leader that Israel needs. God is working in the background to set the stage. So again, we see this, that God moves in the lives of his people. And he works in the background and moves things around for his people. Well, now we get back to the confrontation in the valley. Look, verse 19. It says, now Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment of the host. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel army against army. Now I lost my place. Thank you. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. And so David gets someone to take care of the sheep, and he goes out to the army's camp. And he gets there just in time for the armies to get together to line up in their battle lines. And so he leaves the food with the supply officer and goes down to the battle line. He finds his brothers and starts talking with them, kind of catching up, and they're just kind of hanging out. They're at the battle lines, but they're just hanging out. How can they just be hanging out? Because they're not really fighting, which is interesting because it says they lined up and they were fighting, but they were really just looking at each other and listening to Goliath taunt them and doing nothing about it. And so they were there just lined up waiting for the battle. David finds them and he talks to his brothers. He's catching up with them. And then Goliath comes out. As usual, Goliath comes out and he starts saying what he says every day. But there's one difference now. And the difference is that David is there. David is there. And he's never seen Goliath. He's never heard what he said. In fact, when it says, behold, Goliath comes out, I think we're giving David's perspective there. Because David's just there talking with the brothers, and all of a sudden he's like, who's that guy? And Goliath comes out, and David hears what he says. You see, God got him there just at the right time for him to hear the challenge of Goliath. And this is the turning point of the entire event. David heard him. And David heard him. You see, a person of faith is there now. Someone who truly knows God and understands how God works. Someone who truly trusts God is now aware of the situation, of what is happening, and he will respond. Look, verse 24. It says, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free.
in Israel. And David said to the men who stood by, what shall be done? Let me stop there, actually. And so these people, they have the same response they have every day. Goliath comes out, he taunts them, they're afraid, they run and hide. He's kind of like, guys, who wants to fight me? They all say, not me. And they run and hide. And so they're all talking about it, though, because they're upset about it. They don't really like him. They're annoyed by him, his challenge. They probably feel insulted. I mean, what's this guy doing coming out here and talking to us and defying us? They're afraid of him, but it also appears that they're looking for someone to step up. Because they're like, well, the king says he'll give them this reward, and there's this and that. Who's going to do it? And so they're waiting for someone to step up, and they're all talking about it together. Well, then David is now there. And David's response is different. So you see, the army and Saul, their response, it was not a faith response. But David's response is a faith response. His response is God-centered. Now let's keep reading. Verse 26. It says, and David said to the men who stood by, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so it shall be done to the man who kills him. Now these are the first words of David recorded for us. He asks about what's going on, and he makes a statement. You see, David has gotten into this conversation about the reward, and he asks about it. But David's main interest is not about the reward. You see, his concern is for God's honor. He says, who is this Philistine to defy the armies of who? The living God. You see, David is making this connection between the armies and God. It's not just an army, but it's the armies of the living God. And if he is defying or insulting the army of Israel, he is defying and insulting God. He is disrespecting God, dishonoring God. And so his thoughts go to God. Goliath is dishonoring God, and no one is doing anything about it. You see, he understands who God is, and he understands what God is able to do, and he understands that this ungodly person has no right to dishonor God. And so he's going to do something about it. And he steps up and says, we can't just keep going like this. You see, this is faith thinking. David trusts God. He knows that God will provide and protect them. He will help them. This is faith thinking. He sees more than just what's right in front of him, what's standing right there in front of him. He's running everything through what he knows of God. Kind of like we talked about last week about having that screen of God's ways and God's timing, and that you run all your considerations through it, and you say, well, this doesn't fit, get it out. See, that's what David's doing. He's running his thoughts through what he knows of God and what he understands of God. And he's going to work and live according to that, what he knows about God. And so as he looks at Goliath, he says, Goliath may be big and strong, but he is opposing God. And so he's not big or strong enough. So look what he does. Verse 28. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again as before. So Eliab, David's big brother, tries to put David in his place. He's like, why'd you come down here? Stop talking. He's annoyed by his little brother. And the thing is you'll notice that people of faith are often challenged by people who don't see things the same way. They're often challenged by those who are not people of faith or don't have that same level of faith. But the interesting thing that we see here is that David comes from a regular family. Because he's just like every other brothers do this. The big brother looks down on the younger brother and says, "Why are you here, kid? Why are you sticking your nose in the business of the men?" He's like, "Go home." And David responds just like a little brother and says, "What did I do now? I'm just talking." And so you see this interaction, just a normal family. And then David goes away from his older brother and starts talking to the other guys instead. But he keeps talking. And as he's talking, other people notice what he's saying. When he says things like, "Who is this Philistine to defy God?" and whatever else he's saying, people hear what he's saying, and it gets back to Saul. Look at verse 31. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to fight against this Philistine, to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep the sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." And so Saul is told about what David's been saying, and so he sends for David. Now, for over a month now, the armies have been camped there. And Goliath has come down twice a day to taunt them. And they're not getting anywhere. And so they're looking for someone to step up. But no one has volunteered. Even with the reward that was offered, still no one has volunteered. But now David's been talking big and people hear it, and he says, "You don't need to be afraid of Goliath." And he's saying things like, "Goliath needs to be stopped." And so Saul tells the people, "Bring David here." And when David sees Saul, what's David say? He basically says, "Hey, don't worry about anything. I'll take care of it." Right? He says, "Don't worry about it. I'll take care of him." Now, I don't believe that this was an arrogant, self-confident statement. He's making this statement out of God confidence. He knows what God has done in the past, and he expects that God will work in the same way in the future. And he has confidence in God. He trusts God completely. So he says, "Don't worry about it. I'll take care of the situation." But of course, Saul looks at it and he takes it as self-confidence, takes it as probably overconfidence, and he looks at David and he knows what Goliath looks like, and he says, "There is no way you can fight him. He'll just wipe you. You're nothing." He says, "You're a kid, and Goliath, he's been a warrior since he was a kid. He has experience and size. He has everything on you." He says, "There's no way you could fight him." But then David gives his own qualifications. He's killed lions and bears in order to protect the sheep. But notice that he doesn't say anything about his own skills. I mean, he's talking about his qualifications. Why can't I do this? Well, look, I've killed lions and bears. But he doesn't say, because I'm really good. He doesn't say anything about his own skills, his own abilities. Now, David had to obviously have some skills. I mean, we'll see in the story, he's going to sling a rock with his sling. He obviously had skills. But that's not what's important here. That's not what David is focusing on. What does David focus on as he gives his qualification? He gives all the credit to God. He says, "I've killed the lions and bears," but he says, God delivered me from them. God gave him the ability to do this. God worked through his abilities and gave him the ability to use those skills perfectly and to be successful. at the right time. And he looks at that and how God has helped him in the past. And he says, this will be no different. God did it before. He'll do it again. Again, this is faith thinking. He knows God, and he knows how God works, and he has complete trust in God and in who God is. So David now is ready to go, and he expects God to do this amazing thing and to cause him to defeat Goliath. And God will, because God works through this person of faith. Look at verse 38. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And so Saul had been convinced by David's faith in God. And he gave him the go-ahead, and he actually gave him a little blessing, or he prayed, may God be with you, may the Lord be with you. But then he turns around and says, but here, you need all this armor. He heard all of David's statements, but then said, but here, you need this. Because that's the way Saul thinks. He's thinking naturally. He's not thinking about God. He's thinking about what he sees in front of him. And so he puts all this armor on David, and David can't move in it. It makes me think of a little kid who's wearing his dad's clothes. And you ever seen that? And they kind of wander and they're tripping around. But then imagine the weight on top of that and all that. And David says, I can't fight in this. This isn't how I roll. I've never done this before like this. He says, so he takes it off. He says, I don't need this. And he says, I'm just going to take what I'm used to. So what does he take? He takes his staff, his sling, some stones, and trust in God. He takes his faith, and he goes. Look at verse 41. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. So Goliath, he comes out and he thinks pretty highly of himself. And he was probably pretty surprised to see a little shepherd boy coming out to meet him. For 40 days he had taunted them and said, give me a man to fight. And this shepherd boy with no armor, no weapons, comes out to meet him. He's just carrying a stick, his staff. But not only would Goliath be surprised, he's insulted. Who are you? You're going to come out? What? You can't chase me away like a dog with a stick. What are you going to do? Hit me with it? And so he's insulted by it. He's not just taunting. He's insulted. Why would you even bother? And then he defies David. He actually curses him by his gods. In other words, what he's saying is that me and my gods, we're going to kill you. You are done with. You're toast. And your body's going to be left for the wild animals. Teach you come out and face me like that. Look at verse 45. How does David respond? Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin? But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And that all the assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear, For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. So David does a little trash talking of his own. He comes right back at him with almost the same words, but changed his different slightly. He belittles Goliath's trust in weapons and armor. He says, that's not good enough. You're opposing God. You need a lot more than that to defeat me, because God is with me. God is on David's side. So David says, so bring your best, but it won't be enough. And he says, and it's going to be you and the rest of the Philistines whose bodies are going to be left for the wild animals. Now, why does David say this is going to be the case? Why will David and the Israelite army beat or win this victory over the Philistines? It's not because they have better weapons. It's not because they're better fighters. It's because they have God. And the Philistines have defied God. They have dishonored God. They are opposing God. And he says, and God is stronger than anything you can bring. Now, notice that David, he's not trying to bring any glory to himself. He doesn't say, I'm going to defeat you because I'm better. He simply says, I will defeat you because God. He's not trying to bring glory to himself. He's bringing it to God. It's all about God. So let's read about the battle. Verse 48. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, and he took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. That was the battle. The actual battle, very short. The description, very brief. It was quick and decisive. God won through David. David ran towards him. He took one stone, put it in his sling, slung it. Now, a good slinger could throw a stone about 100 to 150 miles per hour. He put that stone in his sling and he slung it, hit Goliath in the forehead, and Goliath was on the ground. That quick. Quick and decisive. He takes Goliath's sword and cuts off his head. The Philistines run away. The Israelites chase them, pursue them. They win the battle and they come back and they collect all the stuff that the Philistines left behind. It was that easy. No struggle. Quick and decisive. Now, this is a very well-known story. In fact, it's so well-known, it's even become part of our culture, our society. You'll hear people talk about the David and Goliath stories. They'll talk about it in sports. This is a real David versus Goliath contest. Because you have the champion, the team that's won many years, and then you have this underdog, this up-and-comer who really no one knows of. And they beat the champion. And we call that a David versus Goliath story. People will talk about this in like politics. This is a David versus Goliath, because you have the champion, or the well-known and the unknown. We use this phraseology in our society. Not just Christians, but the world uses it. We're familiar with this story. But the point of this story is not about underdogs winning. It's not that an underdog can win a fight or a game or anything. It's not about the underdog winning. Or it's also not like what we listened when my kids were little and we watched VeggieTales. I'm sorry, VeggieTales, but the point is not little guys can do big things too. In fact, a big guy would have had problems with Goliath, right? This isn't about the size of David and that he's able to do great things. The point is that God can do anything. And the person of faith who understands that and lives by it can be used by God in the process. You see, when we live by faith, God may use you and work through you. Do you want to be used by God? I mean, do you want God to use you to teach kids, or to teach adults, or to disciple someone, or to encourage someone, or to help someone come alongside other believers and lift them up? Do you want to be used by God to reach your friends and your neighbors with the gospel? Do you want to be used by God? Well, the answer is quite simple. It sounds like an old song I knew as a kid. Trust and obey. Trust and obey. In other words, you know who God is. You know how He works. So trust Him and do what He tells you to do. Trust and obey. Now here's the cool thing. The person who acts in faith may even be the beginning or the impetus of one of those great works of God. Nothing was happening there at the battle line until David arrived, the person of faith who stepped up and said, "We've got this because God has this." And when he stepped up and he started moving, everything else happened. God did the work and He made it happen, but it didn't happen until the person of faith stepped up. Isn't that cool to think of that? If you are a person of faith and you say, "I'm going to step up and do what God has called us to do," you may be the impetus, the beginning of a great mighty work of God. Because you're listening to God and you're trusting Him. You see, God uses people of faith. God empowers people of faith. God works through people of faith. We have a great God who will do great things. And if you are a person of faith, you just might get to be a part of those great things.